Are you questioning your reality? Do you feel gaslighted? It's not you. It's the media. I am Suchitra Vijayan and I'll be joined by Bhakti Sringarpure and Madhuri Shastri to eviscerate the propaganda, set the record straight and offer much needed moral clarity. Tune in each week. It's not you, it's the media, a podcast by the Polis Project.
So today's episode is called If Book Reviews Could Kill, because guess what? Book reviews can kill entire careers. They can cancel books before anyone's even read them. And book reviews, like any other type of writing, can dehumanize entire groups of people, support wars and genocides, and, well, the actual killing of people, right? So we've decided to dedicate an episode to what seems like a harmless, amusing genre of writing, book reviews, but it's not. So essentially, if we have to define book reviews, it's a piece of literary criticism or an evaluation of recently published books. And these are extremely vital part of all newspapers and media outlets. So if you don't have a book review section or you don't have book reviews on stuff, then it means that your newspaper is probably not worth much, because you're not pulling the weight in terms of shaping culture and opinion about the world. So we're going to focus on the Anglo world and the Anglo publishing industry. I'm sorry, but that's what we know, okay? And we're going to look at the prolific and horribly problematic book review industry. And yes, it is an industry, or what I'm really going to call just a hype machine, from New York to London, to New York to London and back, right? So what's wrong with reviews? So much. We're going to tackle explicit anti-intellectualism. The media's interest is only in reviewing books that are published by big corporate publishers. The total disregard for anything that challenges mainstream narratives. An obsession with extremely accessible and simplistic writing. Not just books that are written simplistically, but also book reviews. And then the fact that the book review industry is really in the business of selling books rather than introducing readers to new ideas, new perspectives. So let's start with explicit anti-intellectualism, right?
I think anti-intellectualism in the United States kind of really starts early on, right? Like, a good way for me to explain this is that many years ago, I was part of a writing workshop at Stanford. And the way that American writing workshops are taught is that the first half, you are given a canon. You are told that these are the writers that you should read. The book that is used for the syllabus is often, there's a compilation that comes, The Great American Short Stories, each year. That book is often used. And we are taught over and over again that Raymond Carver is your quintessential American writer. And the reason why Carver is supposed to be so great is because he writes these crisp, succinct sentences. And we are told that great literature is basically compressing complexity and providing you with a distilled version of everything. And I think that pervades all of American thinking. Even in elite bourgeois places, there is this tendency to think that complex, difficult ideas are for the radical, for the left, for the anarchist. In reality, what we're really engaging with is a certain kind of art. There is a belief that once a form becomes well-respected or famous or popular, that you have to repeat it over and over again. And I think that is really where we are in terms of how we think about anti-intellectualism. It's not some guy in the Midwest saying, oh, we don't want books. It's not book burning. It's not the Bible thumping. Yeah. The rot really is...
It's a structure.
And it's a rot is really the elite. The elite are the ones who actually have a very specific view of what is good writing. And that good writing is completely defined by a very narrow sense of what is considered eloquent, what is considered canon, what is considered sellable. And I think it's all kind of tied in together.
Yeah, that makes me think about what this anti-intellectualism does is essentially flatten everything. It has flattened two things that I can think about. One is the identity or the stories that come out from marginalized writers in other parts of the world. And I think this is really bolstered by this desperate desire for things to be relatable. So you cannot write a complex novel from anywhere else in the world because it just has to be filtered through this white elite lens of relatability. The other thing that it has flattened is the form. So writers are now forced to, as you said, conform to these racist kind of flat standards and pigeonhole their books and shoehorn them into these various little hoops, relatability, understandability, whatever. and you get really the same novel. And these are the novels that we have been told, when if you are writing from Africa or from Asia, like this is the one story. You can tell this is what is marketable, but your prose has to be like this, your English has to be like that, and it just has to be relatable to someone in the heart of America who's reading it. Otherwise, it's not worth the time or
I
the
have a
effort.
good story to complement that. Bhakti knows this. Many years ago, when I was looking for my first agent, the first book proposal of which became Midnight's Borders, I took it to an agent. This person looked at my thing and said, "You're very sellable. I can pitch your book as Eat, Love, Pray meets Passage to India." I think what is interesting in that experience is that it kind of tells you how to pigeonhole a certain person. This was a book about rethinking borders. It was a book about excavating stories. And one of the things I wrote in my book proposal was that I didn't want to be the story. Instead, it kind of tells you that the story that tells is a story of navel gazing, which means that it has to be eat, pray, love, and it has to be this colonial way of looking at the world, which is Passage to India. And the reality is also that when this happened, I was 29 years old, which meant that I very easily could have leaned into, and the book that I ended up writing would have been a very different book than.
Of course, but I think what I'm realizing is that we've given up a chance to turn you into a marketable, heavily photographed writer whose every skirt and dress would have been discussed at length, and New York Times reporters would have popped up in your apartment trying to take fabulous photos of you.
I still think I have it. Look at me. I still think I have a shot
you
at this.
still look good, but does everyone know that? You know,
And
what
is
I mean?
everybody fighting to play you in a biopic of
Are
you?
you the next Jhumpa Lahiri or not? You know, that's
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's it. You are so
I have
flattened.
FOMO for a life that I didn't have.
Yeah. You really missed out there. So, I mean, one of the things in which you can think about what we're calling anti-intellectualism is to also just ask what sort of books get reviewed, right? What is it out there that gets reviewed? And of course, I think there's a disproportionate focus on novels. It's always novels, storytelling, style. This person has a new style. This person has written something from some other small town, wherever, right? And there's always this obsession with reviewing novels. When books do get reviewed that are books of ideas, they're called, first of all, nonfiction. That's already weird. They're defined by what they are not. And what these books are generally these very popularized, strange sort of books that are not, say, from academics. Okay, look, I can do 6 episodes on why I hate academia, but is academia a place where interesting ideas come out? Absolutely. Is academia a place where there is some kind of technical writing that you have to wrestle with? Absolutely. But they will not wrestle with that. So we end up with books like The Outliers, or If Women Are From Mars and Men Are From Venus, or books
The
like
World is Flat.
The World is Flat, everybody's favorite, an explicitly anti-intellectual, unscientific, bizarre concept, which gets reviewed, and of course it's New York Times darling Thomas Friedman, and then it just goes out there. And actually, I forgot to mention before, I got the title for this particular podcast from one of my favorite podcasts. It's called If Books Could Kill, which is co-hosted by Michael Hobbs and Peter Shamshiri. And they have this hilarious line that says, "The airport bestsellers that captured our hearts and ruined our minds." And it's just so funny. And essentially, what we have are these kinds of ideas, like people trying. Outliers became so popular that at some point, people were trying to hold back their kids when they were entering kindergarten so that they could have certain advantages that you get if you enroll your kids late into school, physical and intellectual, apparently. Or they have a great episode on the Hillbilly Elegy, which, as you know, now we have J.D. Vance standing for vice president. And this book it went far and it went wide as an expose. And it was a preposterous book. This is not an intellectual book. So we're never going to have a review of like what the Edward Saids of our time are writing, or what is a work by a philosopher, for example. It's too complicated. It's not accessible.
But Bhakti, didn't you also say that if Edward Said was writing now, his books would be by an obscure academic press, unreviewed,
Exactly.
Unacknowledged.
Yeah.
The fact that we don't have a place where we can go and discover and engage with new critical ideas that might be difficult and might not agree with. We are in ideological silos, and that ideological silos are constructed very specifically.
Yeah, and Edward Said, of course, to his thing, he was always attacked and criticized. And I do remember feeling absolutely broken when in 2003 they wrote an obituary in the New York Times that was just completely, it was a takedown essentially that labeled him as some sort of a terroristic person, this horrible guy who stood for Palestine. It was heartbreaking.
I think we're in like a silos and in a self-reinforcing loop, right? And I wanted to talk a little bit here about this very unholy nexus of identity politics meets the book as a product. I'm really sorry, but we said how writers of color are being forced to write into these white ideas of who they should be in order to make any sort of a living as a writer. Essentially what I'm trying to say is I think the industry is in the business of anointing writers as the next voice of a generation, or like this is the Asian writer you must be reading, and this is the Indian writer you must be reading. And when such a person is anointed, it prohibits anybody from critically engaging with their art, or even okay, critically yes, but even honestly engaging with the art, because in this neoliberal world that is defined by identity politics, the book is just a part of the writer. It just doesn't exist independently of the writer. It's as if their art cannot form independent relationships with the people who read them. And so any critique of the book or any engaging with the book is perceived as a critique of the person, of the writer who's doing it. And the problem with this is that there are so many mediocre, white, caste privileged, whatever it is, elite writers, but they are allowed to be mediocre. They are allowed to fail. They're allowed to come up. But that's not afforded to marginalized writers. And so even if you as a reviewer want to critically engage with a marginalized writer's work, you're very well aware that this could be the end of their career. And nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to take down the next marginalized writer. And at the same time, these books are then existing in this like exalted position where they can't be touched. And they allow the industry and publishers to sort of check their boxes. Like, oh, next big woman of color writer, check. Oh, she also happens to be Black, check. And then that's it. And we would think that this would open up the door to more marginalized writers, but it doesn't. It actually actively shuts it.
I'm actually reminded of a review in the LA Review of Books by a certain writer that was hyped to the T. This is a woman of color, reviewed by another professor of color, which I thought was thoughtful, gracious, well-meaning, but also kind of interrogates the difficult ideas. When that came out, the author accused this other writer, the reviewer, of being white adjacent, claiming that you too are like a white person. The review was truly, I felt,
incisive and smart.
It was incisive, smart, thoughtful, and gracious. It says why. I think you know.
Yeah, I absolutely do.
Well, I hate all this insider baseball, but I'll ask you all later if you don't want to mention this. Mention this stuff. That's fine.
I don't want to be accused of being white on Twitter.
Yeah.
With someone with 100,000.
Absolutely. No, I understand. It's fine. But what this is making me think of is also a kind of function of explicit anti-intellectualism, is that there is a way in which if you are a scholar or if you're an expert on a certain book or a certain author, you will be absolutely not invited to write the review. It has to come from some other universe. It has to come from some other place, from another race, a person who doesn't know anything. And as someone who has been in academic working within African literature and African cultural studies, it's really disheartening to see that when a kind of boom around African writers started, you saw that books by African writers were always being paired with reviewers that had no idea where that writer came from, the country that writer might have come from, or what the context of the book was. And it had to be a sort of voyage of discovery, which is just kind of as colonial as that gets. And I know that the mistakes being made were horrendous, and this has not really changed. Sometimes you're getting pairing, that's okay, but for the most part, the book reviewer is always somebody who knows nothing about that place. And I still remember when a friend of mine who wrote about an African country and wrote this very African novel, she was being reviewed in the New York Times, and she ended up writing a letter to the New York Times because she said, look, I can tell that the book reviewer has stopped reviewing this book at page 81 or whatever, has stopped reading this book. It is that evident. The other incident that I recall, which is much more recent, is when Tsitsi Dangaremba, her third book, This Mournable Body, came out, and there was a lot of hype around it. This is a writer that her book, Nervous Conditions, has been read across the planet. It's assigned constantly. But wow, mainstream media discovered her because the booker anointed her. So now suddenly there was all this hype about her. They found, I don't know who to review her book, but that woman immediately made a mistake. She said this is her second book in 30 years or 20 years, completely oblivious to the fact that this is her third book and that this is a trilogy.
And this was not fact-checked?
No, they didn't fact check. That got published. It stayed like that for a while. I think later on, maybe they added something, the note they add at the end.
Yeah.
Yes, a retraction or something like that. I'm not even sure. But it just stayed like that. This is a trilogy. You have to review it like a trilogy. This is the finale of this character.
But Bhakti, black and brown writers don't get that luxury of fact-checking, of it's
Detailed
just
engagement.
detailed engagement. Like, they absolutely don't, because even if someone has renown can be so
Yeah.
dismissed by the New York Times, like what hope do other black and brown writers have? But it just, they are so dismissive because, oh, this is just some writer in Africa. But that sort of also reminds me when you said that it was just some random person who was called upon to do the review. It sort of makes me think about my earlier point that everything has to be funneled through this lens of white relatability. So if Melissa from Milwaukee can understand what the book is about, only then is it worth reading,
That's my friend. What are you saying about Melissa from Milwaukee?
Well, she got Tsitsi's book.
Yeah, exactly. Because of that review. No, absolutely. No, this is just, unfortunately, this particular thing, specifically as I have tracked it for African literature, is one of the most heartbreaking things for me. Because when Abdul Razak Gurnah from Zanzibar won the Nobel Prize in 2021, all hell broke loose. All hell broke loose. They had nobody for quotes. Random people I knew were being called for quotations on who's this writer? What's this writer? And I still remember that some rumor had gone around that Paradise is the book to read. That's the book to read, because all his books many were out of print. All his books were not available, especially in the US, much more available in England, which is where he lives, but not in the US. And I know that there were libraries, public libraries, where there were massive waitlist queues. I know my mother-in-law in Chicago was number 29 on a waitlist queue at the library for Abdul Razak Gurnah's Paradise. And Amazon priced it at $490. I remember keeping and saving that screenshot because I thought this is just the most preposterous thing I have ever seen. He has written 10 novels, by the way. There's a zillion academic essays on him. If you want to look, you can find. But no, we cannot call upon those experts because that is simply wrong. And soon the establishment got a hold of itself and eventually began to commission some sort of writing on his books. And I remember being so inflamed by the New Yorker because they have the money, the capacity to solicit any writer, any expert who would write a wonderful profile of him. But they picked this white woman who had read like no more than 2 or 3 books of him and offered some pithy observations, all well-intentioned, all good, nothing wrong. But why? Simply why? And it was a really illuminating moment. It was a moment of unmasking and unveiling. And it also showed just how kind of structural all of this stuff is. It's depressing.
In this vein, I think this is going to be a shameless plug for my father-in-law, who is the novelist M.G. Vasanji. But I think it was kind of bizarre to me how he was excluded from these conversations about Gurnah or any sort of like public engagement about Gurnah. And it also baffles me now that I'm talking about him, how he is a very celebrated East African Canadian novelist. He's, if you look at prizes as a metric of success or whatever,
Giller Prize winner.
2-time Giller Prize winner. And yet
14 books.
14 books. He's an OBE, like any sort of medal that a state could bestow on its artist. And yet somehow the only sort of great Canadian novelists that we think about still are Margaret Atwood, Alice Munro. And there's just no scope for like the broadening, because this is not what a Canadian novelist is supposed to look like, right? Yeah. So it's just really bizarre just thinking about sort of the flattening of identities and who has been excluded from these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was just thinking, I think almost a decade ago, I had friends in the journalism school and catching up over coffee. And one of them said, Suchitra, we're all just exchanging box files of James Baldwin's writings. We all want to write like him. And my first response was, but why? You want to understand why James Baldwin wrote the way James Baldwin did because of where he came from. There is a cadence to the way he speaks and writes because of the churches, the sermons that were part of his upbringing. He was someone writing about the beloved people of his life being assassinated. And he was writing from rage, from anger, but also from love. It's impossible for someone like me to ever write like him because it can never be. But what really I was taken aback was that how everybody so openly said that they wanted to imitate the way Baldwin wrote.
It's preposterous.
I know.
And how the professors had told them that, again, this was a decade ago, 2013 feels
Fine,
like
I'm
a
sure
very
it's
different
changed.
world.
I doubt it.
But I was very taken aback by the sense. And then you realize that these journalism schools take great writers and turn them into photocopies of each other. And I do
Right.
this when I teach my class, when I print 4 or 5 essays of men of a certain age, especially Indian men of a certain age who write. I kind of hide who they are. And I ask my students to say, can you tell me the difference between these writers? And my students always come back and say, it's the same person. But all of these 4 pieces that I give them belong to men of a certain age, across religion, across caste, of course, all of them immensely privileged. And you realize once you hide the name, you really don't know. And the idea that you take great writers and journalists and take them into cookie cutters of each other. And often you're taught to write for the New Yorker.
Right.
You're taught to write for the New York Magazine. You're taught to write for the New York Times.
Absolutely.
And I've never once seen a great writer or reporter go through these schools and come out better. If anything, they become a replication. Of course, there are some notable exceptions. But for me, it's just the idea that you would read James Baldwin wanting.
I feel like,
just-
Suchitra, that you're leading us into some sort of a shade towards Ta-Nehisi Coates. No, you're not. You're not. Absolutely not. No, but I mean, that's a good example for us to...
I think so,
that's
yeah.
like, it's like all the media attention is on him. Okay, has been in the recent past and is going to continue for at least another week, right? Because I don't know we know what a news cycle is like 24 hours, but I think a book review cycle and the pure book celebrity that he commands is going to take us through at least a 2 or 3 week cycle, right? So essentially, if you've been living under a rock, may I summarize to our dear listeners, is that Ta-Nehisi Coates has written a book called The Messenger. And Ta-Nehisi Coates went to some places and nobody's going to want to find out which those places were because the problem is one of the places he went to is Palestine.
Right.
And he went there and his eyes were opened and he compares it to the Jim Crow South and he uses the words occupation, apartheid, Zionism, and he is absolutely inflamed and he cannot believe and he is actually even outright saying how wrong he was, how he has messed up in the past, how he has now realized that this was a huge gap in his thinking. And he says, why is this a huge gap in my thinking? Is because the liberal establishment, which has been his home, has never, ever humanized Palestinians or spoken about Israeli colonialism, this settler colonialism, this cruel, violent structure of occupation in any real terms. And they have only dehumanized Palestinians, right? So he comes up and the world has literally exploded. He has taken New York world by fire. He has been on every major talk show. He's going to be written about in every possible magazine. And what's hilarious, of course, is this same establishment had crowned him king, the next James Baldwin. I'm sorry, I was never into that particular thing, but I was always grateful for his insights. I think he's a very sensitive writer. I think he's very much needed in the moment, in the last decade and so on. So here is a writer. And now the same liberal media that has crowned him, anointed him, is just sitting there with every blunt instrument knocking him down. And it is just absolutely out of control.
I share your respect for Ta-Nehisi Coates. And my only issue with what has happened with like the media frenzy around taking him down or basically trying to unmask him in some way is that the message has been he's the messenger and we are shooting the messenger. Like we have no regard for his message at all. No one is talking about what he is actually saying. And that is really problematic to me because the entire emphasis now is on quotes and this is so racist and he went here and everybody's so racist, and I get it. But it's difficult for me to imagine that even Coates wanted this to be the outcome, right? I think the outcome is, no, we should all be talking about Palestine. At every step of the way, we should be redirecting the conversation towards Palestine. And my one gripe with him is that I don't think he has necessarily done that in a sort of passing the mic kind of way. I would like to have seen him resurrect his Twitter account, which was very popular before he deactivated it, and really platform Palestinians. But that hasn't happened. But I do want to say what I think.
But sorry, I think Madhuri, I take your point, and that's what happens with celebrity activism, right? When Taylor Swift endorses Kamala Harris, it all becomes about Taylor Swift. It doesn't become about the campaign or what Harris stands for. And the celebrity activism becomes just mired in debates about the celebrity's personality, their past, and how he said this and how she said that. So I understand that he's gone deep into that trap. But to your point that he should be passing the mic to Palestinians, 100%. But it's kind of funny because it reminds me of Parul Sehgal's review in The New Yorker.
Parul Sehgal's criticism of Ta-Nehisi Coates, some of them were definitely criticism that one had to listen. And yet it felt so disingenuous because the time, the context, and how it was done. But the most important thing is that here is a writer who is, for all purposes, really taking down a writer. But why now? And from where?
Yeah, exactly.
And from where is the most important question. The New Yorker is an extended arm of the empire. The same New Yorker is the one that justified and defended the war in Iraq. The same New Yorker that continues to platform white writers in their magazine. I think Erin Overby, who was the archival editor at New Yorker, came up with this thing where she sees that the way New Yorker diversifies is to really platform black and brown writers and relegate them to the digital, where you are paid a few $100s for a piece at best, while the print, which an essay could get you few $1,000s at the least, is still reserved for predominantly white writers. Mm-hmm. The same New Yorker that will platform a Palestinian and yet refuse to clearly articulate that this Palestinian from Gaza, this writer and poet that you are platforming, was not detained, but illegally kidnapped and tortured. And when you are writing from this place, why then are you writing to claim that this writer, and all of the critique was that how he takes up space, but in reality, what
ridiculous.
he does is exactly what Palestinians have asked us to do,
Yeah.
which is to say, if you see in us your lived reality, speak up. And of course, that's what he does.
Absolutely.
Well, actually, sorry, just to this point.
Yeah, go on.
I think what Coates has done is so brilliant. The one thing that I think is absolutely brilliant is the utter unmasking of even the most progressive, neutral book reviewers, right? Like, again, nothing against Parul, but I think she has been unmasked because the very brilliant thing that his essay does, and I haven't read it, but I know that the brilliant thing that his essay does is filter the apartheid experience that he saw in Palestine through the lens of Jim Crow. And he's saying it is so bad. What happened in the South has been perfected. That kind of discrimination, segregation in Palestine, right? And so he was anointed. He wrote the case for reparations, and he was anointed as this voice of Black progressive America. And the liberals anointed him. And when he's now saying, and they're dismissing what he's saying about Palestine, they're essentially saying, we don't care about Black Americans.
Yeah,
We never have.
exactly.
We anointed you because the time was right. But yada, yada, yada. So what? Your experience of Jim Crow is kind of like apartheid. Never gave a crap about that anyway.
Can I also add one to this? Like, I completely agree that Coates must be passing on the mic to more Palestinians. We want to hear from Palestinians. But I also want to say that the few Palestinians who do get those panels, let's just look at how they are so poorly treated.
Yeah.
Nora Arakat, every time she gets on an interview, it's like she has to first spend the 30 seconds explaining to her why Palestinians are human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There was a particularly painful episode for me because I saw Amna Nawaz of PBS, who I genuinely like and I think she's done some good work, ask Nora the exact same questions. when Nora is like, how can you continue asking me these questions a year into this genocide?
Yeah.
There are interviews of Muhammad El-Kurd that I see when, he says, are you okay with the violent dispossession and occupation of my land? Are you okay with me? And then you're thinking, Palestinians have always spoken.
Right.
Palestinians have always had the moral political clarity. They have always narrated to the world what's happening to them. And those few instances, even with Piers Morgan's show, when he brings on Palestinians,
Oh my
Oh,
God.
that's the worst.
it's like, yes, you are passing on the mic, but even
That's
the
not.
passing on the mic feels like utter and absolute dehumanization of the existence. So we are also in this economy
They're
where
only brought to be attacked.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, exactly. That's right. The function that they serve
Yeah.
is very particular, right?
Yeah.
Like that's not. But to me, that wouldn't be passing on the mic.
Yeah.
it is not.
You know,
No,
yeah.
that's not the passing on the mic. But I
Yeah.
have to say that I do want to give credit to Aaron Beatty, who has a great Twitter account. And he really managed to articulate what was wrong with the Parul Sehgal review of Coates' book. Where he said this thing, he said, something about the New Yorker review of the Coates' book might make a lot of good and valid points about the book, and yet doesn't quite earn or explain the dismissiveness with which it disposes of the book's author. And it's very interesting, this sort of both sidism, objectivity, neutrality. She's like, oh, it's lovely how he does it, but oh, he does it so badly. Why now? And then Aaron Beatty points out that she then scorches him by then bringing Isabella Hamid, who's a Palestinian writer who just published Recognizing the Stranger on Palestine and Narrative, and she scorches him by quoting her, who has shown fatigue with the idea of these people who have suddenly last minute realized things are really, really bad in Palestine. And then Beatty reminds us, why did they not review Hamid?
Right.
You know, they're just instrumentalizing her to dismiss, scorch, and cancel Coates. It's really, what a mess.
I'm not even sure if they've reviewed any of her novels, by the
No,
way.
they've never.
This is not her first book. I think the New York Times reviewed The Parisian, but I'm not sure that they've reviewed any of her
I
work.
see.
I think the Coates spectacle and debacle have really shown us that there is no concern in America. There is no understanding of the interconnectedness of non-white struggle and the long, long arm of the empire, whether it is in anointing someone and then dismissing their positions. And then when they point out a connection, an empire connection, saying, we don't care.
Yeah, and it's kind of been fun at some level to see people who will not touch this topic with a barge pole having to engage because they don't want to be seen as anti-black or racist, and they want to continue to uphold what Coates means to our society, a sort of conscience. And Jon Stewart, for example, very nice guy, good guy, great jokes, super amiable, always like him, but with like truly limited in how far he goes with A, Palestine, and B, in general, in terms of critique, right? He had to have Coates on and have him explain everything and had to utter a few times the word Palestine too. And then even Trevor Noah, yes, he's South African, he's black and adorable, but super flaky, you know, whatever. Trevor Noah, I love his accents. I think he's super fun, but
Bhakti, he
never
wrote
ever serious, you know?
And he wrote a book called Born a Crime.
I know.
So how could you not utter the word Palestine? I mean,
know.
come on,
you,
Trevor.
you forget the more powerful Swiss-German part.
Yeah, exactly.
Come on, Trevor.
But also the fact that he has made a career of sort of lightening the pill around big concepts like racism and stuff like that.
Anti-intellectualism, going back to anti-intellectualism.
100%. 100% anti-intellectual. But anyway, Coates had to come and explain everything, and Noah had to be super sympathetic and all that. So, you know, I love what it has done for our
I agree.
contemporary society. It has just shown everyone up, and it's kind of hilarious to see, and I'm grateful to Coates for that. And I don't know if I'll read the book. I'm sure it's okay. It's just been a great unveiling, unmasking
For sure.
tool almost. He's kind of weaponized in some way this whole industry, and it's plainly there for us to see. But the other thing about the Ta-Nehisi Coates debacle, it also sort of proves, and there's a very old history of that, which is this notion that there is a sort of structural, ideological belief that art and literature must always be decoupled from politics. There is this sort of idea that became popular was popularized with the Cold War, when the CIA went and backed all these million different magazines in different parts of the world, is that art should not be propaganda. Art that is communist propaganda is wrong. So we must always write from a neutral, objective position. So they created this idea of a sort of liberal that's not super left. So I think what was interesting is that when the CIA pushed this idea by backing all these magazines, by generating a certain style of writing that is liberal, neutral, objective, not overly political, they really managed to embed an idea that we have inherited to this day, that if a piece of art or a piece of literature is explicitly political, has a political perspective, that means it's probably not very good in terms of style or in terms of storytelling and so on, that it's been compromised by the politics itself. And if it's a book that's explicitly political, then it can never be literary, or it can never be beautiful, or it can never be lyrical or evocative. So we are in a moment where the US, of course, for I don't know, since my memory of the US, since my birth, is just involved in these violent wars abroad. But what do the bookshelves look like in an American home? While something crazy is going on and people are dying because of US bombs and US soldiers, what is the book that's on every New York Times bestseller list? It's something like Tuesdays with Morrie. And totally legit, a memoir of AIDS, it's all good, but nothing else. So we just end up with this recycling of this idea. And the most propagandist idea that took root is the idea that art should not be propaganda. And it's kind of crazy to me. And we're still within that framework.
And to juxtapose it, all of empire's canon is justifying the empire.
Yeah.
From time immemorial, what we really have is a justification of the destruction of the brown and black bodies. Post the Afghanistan and Iraq engagements, the number of movies, the number of books, the number of television shows that depict these men who go into Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, violently kill those people, destroy their homes, and then come back and feel sorry. And now we see that replicated in the recent CNN article about IDF soldiers coming back, where this person literally says that this soldier who's bulldozed to 100 people comes back home, and I think he kills himself. And his sister is worried that people think he's a war criminal. And she says, no, I think he's a person with a good heart. And this other IDF soldier who claims that, like, now that he's bulldozed over live people, he can no longer eat meat. And I'm like, are you kidding me?
I know.
But then it's not new, because Golda Meir once says, she's a very famous quote saying that we will never forgive you for making us kill your children.
Yeah.
And
oh my God,
that's a very famous Golda Meir thing where she says that we will never forgive the Palestinians because look what you've made us do. And that is really what is repeated over and over again.
The sensitive sniper, the traumatized torturer, the sensitive soldier. I mean, what is this? This is just, it's absolutely criminal the way this goes out. I still remember that New York Times gave space to several op-eds by this guy who was a torturer, I think at Guantanamo or something like that. And he was full of remorse.
Oh,
and
the prison guard who was the
something like
I
that.
remember this. Yeah.
There was some crazy thing.
And also this one essay from this guy who, when Obama's drone regime kind of comes out, you see a proliferation of, this is how the world looks like from the perspective of a drone. I'm like, I don't give a shit about how the world looks from the perspective of a drone. Like, why is Atlantic doing a 16-page cover on this is how the world... I don't give a shit. I really don't give a shit.
I know.
When your drones are used to kill people on the ground.
Yeah.
And that's also why I have serious concerns about pieces that talk about Israeli technology that obliterates. It feels more like an ad campaign for the Israelis than humanizing. I don't need to know
It's total propaganda.
what technology birthed that this weapon of torture that evaporates human bodies. And every time you see that, it feels like a propaganda. It feels like...
Absolutely. And it ties into this, what we call cyber utopianism or whatever, right? That is always the sort of monstrous notions of technology. Technology is amazing, but yes, sometimes there are some little problems. Sometimes there's an issue. And this idea, this humanizing. To what degree are you going to humanize these people who are literal cannibals and murderers and savages? It is really It's really extraordinary. And when Warscapes first started in 2011, 50% of the submissions that I got, even more maybe, were veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan wars and how they were traumatized, how they couldn't believe what they saw. And I am sympathetic to the idea that young boys are recruited into the military and then they go there and they have no idea what's happening. I am sympathetic to it. But I am not sympathetic to an industry that can only engage with that one perspective. It's completely wrong. And then, of course, you do have the Muslim writer, the black writer from various wars, or the Vietnamese writer that then gets anointed. And that's also a type of meaning-making activity, right? You choose the one person, and you take that one person and you go with your hype machine, and that's the only view we're ever going to get from that particular thing. And I'm thinking of Khalid Hosseini and the Kite Runner, which is like, for a long time after 9/11, that was the only thing anybody knew about Afghanistan, that they have these young boy dancers, that there's rampant rape and pedophilia, and just how bad these Afghans are and the Taliban are. And it's just sort of like, no shade to his book. It's a sensitive, good book, but it's the only one they ever found.
But also places it within the canon, like Oppenheimer. The film came out.
Oh, the film,
What was Oppenheimer doing? Oppenheimer was putting a man who created the atomic bomb as someone struggling with a moral question. There is no moral question. What moral question exists when you have obliterated, like you've destroyed people? There is no moral question. And now what will happen is that in 50 years' time, you will have some moron make a movie about the moral quandary of creating these weapons that annihilated Palestinians. There will be a story about a Palestinian kid who will become part of the Avenger moral universe, where this will be the origin story of, I'm just like, I cannot. I really cannot.
And the review industry will just salivate.
I'm feeling very depressed right now.
It is very depressing because the cherry picking is also done, like the anointing and the cherry picking is not done to really give someone a leg up or whatever. It is done to clear their own conscience, to be like, there is a black woman writer. There is a Palestinian writer. Now the rest of you progressives, shut up. It is simply to clear their own conscience. And that is why it is so problematic to me. You know?
I just want to take a minute to just talk about book review places that are good, right? I mean, you mentioned LA Review of Books. I think they're very good. I think Africa's a Country runs good reviews. Granted, I'm biased. I write for them. I think I write good reviews for them.
Can I also plug that my first writing job was for Bhakti's Warscapes when I reviewed Aruni Kashyap's book. My first paid writing gig was...
Yeah, there's lots and lots of wonderful alternate, smaller spaces that are going to explore a book and work through it and not be afraid, because they're not in the business of just trying to sell that book or that author or that author's clothes or whatever it is that these magazines are doing. That said, while there's still Oprah, I think this universe is still going to be a mess.
Sarah Jessica Parker, Reese Witherspoon, and Mindy Kaling, I'm sure.
I think Sarah Jessica Parker is not that influential, is she? I think it's Reese Witherspoon. That is an
Sarah
empire.
Jessica Parker.
Didn't she publish Fatima Mirza's book?
Yeah, she didn't publish it. She made it into her book club pick. And then, you know, she had a dinner and there were like a lot of white women were at the dinner reading the book or whatever. I don't know. But it was very fancy.
But, you know, I just also want to give a shout out to Biblio that does some good work. I think Biblio did a really great review of Vikram Sampat's book. He's like an Indian writer for historian, which I thought was an absolute masterclass. I wish they were more consistent. I wish they were more accessible. But I also want to point out that some of the best reviews I've read or heard in the last year is actually from Book Talk and TikTok. That review that I shared with you and Madhuri, the one of the Trinity of Fundamentals, I think is this young, I think she's Palestinian reviewer. I can't recall their name. They did this phenomenal breakdown of the Trinity of Fundamentals.
For the non-Gen Z that listen to this, if they're listening to this, then I think we can call them video essays.
Oh my. TikTok will be
it's video essays. I mean, that's a whole genre that's amazing. Of course, what sucks is that the Oprah, Reese Witherspoon industry also grabs onto that. And at this point, they are a formidable presence, especially Oprah. Year after year, she picks absurd books. And when she does, even I feel kind of like, oh my God, Oprah's picked the book. I need to at least go through and see
I mean,
what is happening.
With Jeffrey Epstein and P. Diddy, maybe not anymore.
Yeah, maybe not. That's true. That's true.
I think I'm just too gaslit by reviews because often I've read these reviews and now I know a little bit more being in the industry about the book to pipeline review when you have a book as a product.
Absolutely.
And you have agents who bless them, do amazing work, but it is their job to get galleys to reviewers and it is their job to get the book on the bestseller list and then a prize and da-da-da. And once you know how books end up being reviewed, I think I look at every review with a jaundiced eye and I feel very, very gaslit by reviews.
Yeah.
So I'm currently, sorry to say, not very engaged in reading them and more invested in publishing good reviews at the Polis Project.
Yeah.
But I do like this sort of word of mouth community. You know, I trust my friends. I trust them as good readers. And I do like the word of mouth that TikTok has sort of brought back, right?
Absolutely.
Because that's what the book review industry was trying to do. Like you have one reviewer and you trust their judgment. You're like, oh, this person, I trust their judgment. But that has just changed into this person parroting the views of their organization.
Absolutely.
I just want to say
cannot-
that Madhuri and I bonded over our mutual hatred for a certain book when it came
true.
out because it was so universally beloved. We were like, and she was like, "What did you think of this book?" And I was like, "Eh." And she was
No.
like, "Oh," and I was like, "I think we're going to be good friends because how about you?"
That was a big moment of gaslighting for me. And
Wow.
since then, I feel like I have been unable to consume a review.
Wait, do you question your reality? Do you feel gaslighted?
I'm
It's not
realizing
you.
now.
It's not you. It's the media.
It's the media.